Welcome to the most boring show on internet, where I read book. Chapter 2. Fucking chapter 1 was 87 goddamn pages. Dorian, are you dying? Hope he's not dying. Chapter 2. The conditions for the existence of propaganda. The conditions for the existence of propaganda. Why and how does propaganda exist? We have already noted that propaganda was not the same in the past as it is today, that its nature has changed. We have also said that one cannot simply make any propaganda just anywhere at any time or in any fashion. Without a certain milieu, propaganda cannot exist. Only under certain conditions can the phenomenon of propaganda appear and grow. The most obvious of these are accidental or purely historical conditions. Beyond that, it is clear, for example, that the emergence of propaganda is connected with a number of scientific discoveries. Modern propaganda could not exist without the mass media, the inventions that produced press, radio, television, and motion pictures, or those that produce the means of modern transportation, and which permit crowds of diverse individuals from all over to assemble easily and frequently. Present-day propaganda meetings no longer bear any relation to past assemblies, to the meetings of the Athenians in Agora or of the Romans in the Forum. Then there is the scientific research in all the other fields, sociology and psychology, for example. Without the discoveries made in the past half-century by scientists who never wanted this, there would be no propaganda. The findings of social psychology, depth psychology, behaviorism, group sociology, sociology of public opinion are the very foundations of the propagandist's work. In a different sense, political circumstances have also been effective and immediate causes of the development of massive propaganda. The First World War, the Russian Revolution of 1917, Hitler's Revolution of 1933, the Second World War, the further development of revolutionary wars since 1944 in China, Indochina, and Algeria, as well as the Cold War, each was a step in the development of modern propaganda. With each of these events, propaganda developed further, increased in depth, discovered new methods. At the same time, it conquered new nations and new territories. To reach the enemy, one must use his weapons. This undeniable argument is the key to the systematic development of propaganda. And in this way, propaganda has become a permanent feature in nations that actually despise it, such as the United States and France. Let us also note the influence of doctrines and men. It is clear that a particular doctrine can make propaganda the very center of political life, the essence of political action, rather than merely an accessory or an incidental and rather suspect instrument. Leninism, as developed by Mao, is really a doctrine of propaganda plus action, indissolubly linked to Marxism, of which it is an expression. As Leninism spreads, propaganda develops with it, by necessity and not by choice. In addition, certain men have greatly helped the development of propaganda. Hitler and Goebbels, for example, had a genius for it, but the role of such men is never decisive. They do not invent propaganda. It does not exist just because they want it to. They are only the producers and directors, the catalysts, who profit from the confluence of favorable circumstances. All this is too well known and too obvious to dwell on, but the sum of certain conditions is still not enough to explain the development of propaganda. The overall sociological conditions in a society must provide a favorable environment for propaganda to succeed. The same factors of influence will have different weights and effectiveness in different contexts. The media employed by propagandists can work only in a particular sociological structure. This reciprocal influence of propaganda and social structure is precisely one of the problems that need to be studied. Ernst Kriss and Nathan Laetz have properly noted that public responses to the impact of propaganda have changed considerably in the past few decades, and that this change is the result of trends in the psycho-sociological conditions of 20th century life. And then we get to our sub-chapter 1, the sociological conditions. Individualist society and mass society. For propaganda to succeed, a society must first have two complementary qualities. It must be both an individualist and a mass society. These two qualities are often considered contradictory. It is believed that an individualist society, in which the individual is thought to have a higher value than the group, tends to destroy groups that limit the individual's range of action, whereas a mass society negates the individual and reduces him to a cipher. But this contradiction is purely theoretical and a delusion. In actual fact, an individualist society must be a mass society, because the first move toward liberation of the individual is to break up the small groups that are an organic fact of an entire society. In this process, the individual frees himself completely from family, village, parish, or brotherhood bonds, only to find himself directly... I looked up this word earlier, vis-a-vis, directly vis-a-vis the entire society, vis-a-vis. I have to look it up again. In relationship with.
Vis-a-vis.
Vis-a-vis. Vis-a-vis. Only to find himself directly in relationship to the entire society. When individuals are not held together by local structures, the only form in which they can live together is an unstructured mass society. Similarly, a mass society can only be based on individuals, that is, on men in their isolation, whose identities are determined by their relationships with one another. Precisely because the individual claims to be equal to all other individuals, he becomes an abstraction and is in effect reduced to a cipher. What is a cipher? Isn't a cipher like a code to break, or it's like a code? It's the algorithm to break a code. Oh, it's a secret disguised way of writing a code. Secret encode. So, what he's calling an individual's reduced to a cipher, we're reduced to a secret or disguised way of writing. What? We're just... a monogram? What? I don't get what he means by left to a cipher. So, what he's calling an individual's reduced to a cipher, we're reduced to a secret or disguised way of writing. What? We're just... a monogram? What? I don't get what he means by left to a cipher. What does it mean if a person is a cipher? A cipher can be a person, often fictional character who is blank slate. That is how I use the word when talking. A cipher has so little personality, such a nothing, that the readers and viewers can project their own ideas and values onto the character. Oh, okay. So a cipher is a fictional character who is a blank slate. And that's how I use when walking. A cipher has so little personality as such a nothing that the readers can view and project their own ideas and values onto the character. That's like in the video game Chrono Trigger. The main character Chrono, he doesn't have any dialogue, so he's a cipher. So like the player projects his own ideas and values onto the character because the character doesn't even have any dialogue. Oh, that's interesting. That's a cool word. I didn't know that. We're learning. Okay. So, a benefit to reading is you learn new words. Provided you look them up, I guess, as you're reading. Well, even if you don't look them up, you can kind of usually get a sense of a new word by the context of the group, or the context of the sentence to determine what it means. As soon as local organic groupings are reformed, society tends to cease being individualistic and thereby to lose its mass character as well. So we need to reform the local organic groups. What then occurs is the formation of organic groups of elite in what remains a mass society, but which rests on the framework of strongly structured and centralized political parties, unions, and so on. These organizations reach only an active minority, and the members of this minority cease to be individualistic by being integrated into such organic associations. From this perspective, individualistic society and mass society are two corollary wow.
Corollary.
Why couldn't I say that word? I know that word. I couldn't think of how to say it. From this perspective, individualistic society and mass society are two corollary aspects of the same reality. This corresponds to what we have said about the mass media. To perform a propagandistic function, they must capture the individual and the mass at the same time. Holy fuck, it is hot as balls. No way. Oh, man. I'm gonna open up the fucking... Maybe I'll quit early because it's so fucking hot. I'm sweating my ass off. But it's probably hotter outside, so this will just make it worse. Propaganda can be effective only in an individualistic society, by which we do not mean the theoretical individualism of the 19th century, but the genuine individualism of our society. Of course, the two are not diametrically opposed. Where the greatest value is attributed to the individual, the end result is a society composed, in essence, only of individuals, and therefore one is not integrated. But although theory and reality are not in total opposition, a great difference nevertheless exists between them. In individualist theory, the individual has eminent value. Man himself is the master of his life. In individualist reality, each human being is subject to innumerable forces and influences, and is not at all the master of his own life. As long as solidly constituted groups exist, those who are integrated into them are subject to them, but at the same time, they are protected by them against such external influences as propaganda. An individual can be influenced by forces such as propaganda only when he is cut off from membership in local groups. Because such groups are organic and have a well-structured material, spiritual, and emotional life, they are not easily penetrated by propaganda. For example, it is much more difficult today for outside propaganda to influence a soldier integrated into a military group or a militant member of a monolithic party than to influence the same man when he is a mere citizen. Nor is the organic group sensitive to psychological contagion, which is so important to the success of mass propaganda. One can say, generally, that 19th century individualist society came about through the disintegration of such small groups as the family or the church. Once these groups lost their importance, the individual was left substantially isolated. He was plunged into a new environment, generally urban, and thereby uprooted. He no longer had a traditional place in which to live. He was no longer geographically attached to a fixed place, or historically to his ancestry. An individual thus uprooted can only be part of a mass. He is on his own, and individualist thinking asks of him something he has never been required to do before, that he, the individual, become the measure of all things. Thus, he begins to judge everything for himself. In fact, he must make his own judgments. He is thrown entirely on his own resources. He can find criteria only in himself. He is clearly responsible for his own decisions, both personal and social. He becomes the beginning and the end of everything. Before him, there was nothing. After him, there will be nothing. His own life becomes the only criterion of justice and injustice, of good and evil. In theory, this is admirable, but in practice, what actually happens? The individual is placed in a minority position and burdened at the same time with a total crushing responsibility. Such conditions make an individualistic society fertile ground for modern propaganda. The permanent uncertainty, the social mobility, the absence of sociological protection and of traditional frames of reference, all these inevitably provide propaganda with malleable environment that can be fed information from the outside and conditioned at will. The individual left to himself is defenseless, the more so because he may be caught up in the social current, thus becoming easy prey for propaganda. As a member of a small group, he was fairly well protected from collective influences, customs, and suggestions. He was relatively unaffected by changes in the society at large. He obeyed only if his entire group obeyed. This does not mean that he was freer, but only that he was determined by his local environment and by his restricted group, and very little by broad ideological influences or collective psychic stimuli. The common error was to believe that if the individual were liberated from the smaller organic groups, he would be set free. But in actual fact, he was exposed to the influence of mass currents, to the influence of the state, and direct integration into mass society. Finally, he became a victim of propaganda. Physically and psychologically uprooted, the individual became much less stable. The stability of the peasantry, for example, is one of the reasons why this group is relatively unaffected by propaganda. Goebbels himself recognized that the peasants could be reached only if their structured milieu was shattered, and the difficulties that Lenin experienced in integrating the Russian peasantry into the pattern of the revolution are well known. Thus, here is one of the first conditions for growth and development of modern propaganda. It emerged in Western Europe in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century precisely because that was when society was becoming increasingly individualistic and its organic structures were breaking down. But for propaganda to develop, a society must also be a mass society. It cannot be a society that is simply breaking up or dissolving. It cannot be a society about to disappear, which might well be a society in which small groups are breaking up. The society that favors the development of propaganda must be a society maintaining itself, but at the same time taking on a new structure, that of a mass society. Of the innumerable books on the masses, The Revolt of the Masses by Jose Ortega y Gasset is still valid despite the criticism of many sociologists. Elmo Roper's classification of influential groups in the United States is well known. About 90% of the population is politically inert. They become active only accidentally when they are set into motion, but they are normally inactive, inattentive, manipulable, and without critical faculty. Qualities that form the masses. Throughout, we are discussing the mass man, the average man. The relationship between mass and crowds has been much discussed, and distinctions have been drawn between masses and massification. The first is the gathering of a temporary crowd. The second, the involvement of individuals in a permanent social cycle. Certainly, a crowd gathered at a given point is not, properly speaking, a mass. A mass society is a society with considerable population density in which local structures and organizations are weak. Currents of opinion are strongly felt. Men are grouped into large and influential collectives. The individual is part of these collectives, and a certain psychological unity exists. Mass society, moreover, is characterized by a certain uniformity of material life. Despite differences of environment, training, or situation, the men of mass society have the same preoccupations, the same interests in technical matters, the same mythical beliefs, the same prejudices. The individuals making up the mass are in the grip of propaganda, may seem quite diversified, but they have enough in common for propaganda to act on them directly. A mass society is also a strongly organized society. John Albig makes a profound observation when he says that propaganda is an inevitable concomitant of the growth of an organization of society. Concomitant? is it? Naturally accompanying or associating.
Concomitant.
Concomitant. In contemporary society, there actually is a close relation between mass and crowd. Because a mass society exists, crowds can gather frequently. That is, the individual constantly moves from one crowd to another, from a street crowd to a factory crowd, or a theater crowd, a subway crowd, a crowd gathered at a meeting. Conversely, the very fact of belonging to crowds turns the individual more and more into a mass man, and thus modifies his very being. There is no question that man's psychic being is modified by his belonging to a mass society. This modification takes place even if no propaganda appeal is made to the soul of the crowd or the spirit of the collective. This individual produced by a mass society is more readily available, more credulous, more suggestible, more excitable. Under such conditions, propaganda can develop best. Because a mass society existed in Western Europe at the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, propaganda became possible and necessary. From mass society emerged the psychological elements most favorable to propaganda, symbols and stereotypes. Of course, these also exist in small groups and limited societies, but there they are not the same kind, number, or degree of abstraction. In a mass society, they are more detached from reality, more manipulable, more numerous, more likely to provoke intense but fleeting emotions, and at the same time, less significant, less inherent in personal life. The symbols in a primitive society do not permit the free and flexible play of propaganda because they are rigid, stable, and small in number. Their nature is also different. Of religious origin at first, they become political. In mass society, finally, we find the maximum deviation between public opinions and latent private opinions, which are either repressed or progressively eliminated. Let's see here. Probably want. It's not really a good time to. Okay, we'll just power through. We got like 4 more pages. Thus, the masses in contemporary society have made propaganda possible. In fact, propaganda can act only where man's psychology is influenced by the crowd or mass to which he belongs. Besides, as we have already pointed out, the means of disseminating propaganda depend on the existence of the masses in the United States. In the United States, these means are called mass media of communications with good reason. Without the mass to receive propaganda and carry it along, propaganda is impossible. We must also consider the importance of public opinion in this connection. Public opinion, as we presently think of it, also needs a mass society. In fact, in the presence of stimulus or an act, there must be exchanges of opinion, actions, and interactions, which are the first steps in the formation of public opinion. There must also be an awareness of existing opinions, of private opinions, or implicit public opinions. Finally, there must be a reappraisal of values and attitudes. Only then is there really a crystallized public opinion. It is obvious that in order for this entire process to take place, a very close relationship among a great number of people is necessary. The kind of public opinion we mean, the kind used by propaganda and necessary for it, cannot exist in a community of 50 or 100 persons, isolated from the outside world, whether it be a monastery or a village of the 15th century, or in a society of very low population density, in which a man has only very distant contacts with other men, meeting once a month at the marketplace, for instance, does not permit the wide dissemination of personal views needed to form public opinion. Thus, for propaganda to be effective psychologically and sociologically, a combination of demographic phenomena is required. The first is population density. With a high frequency of diversified human contacts, exchanges of opinions and experiences, and with primary importance placed on the feeling of togetherness. The second is urban concentration, which, resulting from the fusion between mass and crowd, gives the mass its psychological and sociological character. Only then can propaganda utilize crowd effects. Only then can it profit from the psychological modifications that collective life produces in the individual, and without which practically none of the propaganda would take. Much more, the instruments of propaganda find their principal source of support in the urban concentration. Buying a newspaper or a radio set or listening to a broadcast is a social act that presumes a mass structure of society. A total subordination to certain imperatives felt only when one is plunged into a mass in which each person places value on the accomplishment of this social act. Even more, to go to the movies or a political meeting presumes a physical proximity and therefore the existence of concentrated masses. In fact, a political organizer will not bother to hold his meeting if he knows he can get together only 10 or 15 people, and individuals will not come readily from a great distance. Because regular attendance is essential for attaining propaganda effects through meetings or films, the mass is indispensable. The majority effect, so essential as a means of propaganda, can be felt only in a mass society. For example, the argument that all Frenchmen want peace in Algeria, or on the other hand, all Frenchmen want to hold on to Algeria, is valid only if all Frenchmen represents an immediate and massive reality. Thus, the mass society was a primary condition for the emergence of propaganda. Once formed, it evoked the power and functions of propaganda. Although we shall not go into the matter of individual psychology, we must remember, in Stoicism's excellent words, that the conditions of life in mass societies tend to multiply individual frustrations. They produce abstract, fragmentary relations between people, totally devoid of intimacy. One can show how the feeling of insecurity or anxiety develops, trace the contradictions of our environment, the conflicts between socially accepted competition and the preaching of fraternal love, between the constant stimulation of our needs through advertising and our limited finances, between our legal rights and the shackles of reality. Propaganda responds psychologically to this situation. The fact that propaganda addresses itself to the individual but acts on the mass explains, for example, the unity between the types of propaganda that are apparently diverse, such as propaganda based on the prestige of the leader, of the hero, or even of the expert, and propaganda based on the prestige of the majority. Of course, in the exercise of propaganda, both types have specific functions, but it is important to emphasize here that these two types are not very different from each other. The leader or expert who enjoys authority and prestige among the mass is the man who best speaks for that mass. The ordinary man must see himself reflected in his leader. The leader must be a sublimation of the ordinary man. He must not seem to be of a different quality. The ordinary man must not feel that the leader transcends him. This quality of the average man in the hero, actor, dictator, sports champion, has been clearly demonstrated in the history of the past 30 years. It is what E. Morin emphasizes in his study of the deification of film stars. I know that with the NBA, Steph Curry is more popular than LeBron James, even though LeBron James is better because Steph Curry is like he has like a normal human body, whereas like LeBron James looks like a genetic experiment to create the perfect human. Like LeBron looks like a Greek god. He's like 6'8" and chiseled, and Steph Curry, he looks like he's like 6'2". He looks like he just got a normal body. He looks like so like the ordinary man can identify with Steph Curry and relate to Steph Curry more than LeBron James. Hence, he's far more popular than LeBron James. When a man follows the leader, he actually follows the mass, the majority group that the leader so perfectly represents. The leader loses all power when he is separated from his group. No propaganda can emanate from a solitary leader. Moses is dead on the propaganda level. All we have left is a Johnson or a de Gaulle, stripped of individual characteristics and clad in the aura of the majority. I don't know what he means by that. The leader loses all power when he is separated from his group. No propaganda can emanate from a solitary leader. Some may raise objections to this analysis, which sees fundamental requirements for the development of propaganda in the creation of an individualistic society and a mass society, because only in that combination can the material means and dictatorial will of the state take shape. The first objection is based on the emergence in our society of new local organic groups, for example, political parties and labor unions, which seem to be contrary to the existence of the individualistic structure and the mass structure. The answer to this is, first, that such groups are still far from having the solidarity, the resistance, the structuring of old organic groups. They have not had the time to consolidate themselves. One has only to look at their fragility, their fluctuations, their changes. They are not really groups of resistance against mass influence, though, like a party that exchanges a democratic or monolithic form for a monolithic form, they try to be by taking on authoritarian structures. Second, such new groups cannot be real obstacles to total propaganda. They can resist one particular propaganda, but not the general phenomenon of propaganda, for the development of the groups takes place simultaneously with the development of propaganda. These groups develop inside a society propagandized to the extreme. They are themselves loci of propaganda. They are instruments of propaganda and are integrated into its techniques. We are no longer in a sociological situation comparable to that of traditional societies in which there was barely any mass propaganda and almost nothing other than local psychological influences. And when propaganda did enter into such societies, it had to fight existing local groups and try to influence and modify them, and these organic groups resisted. At present, we are witnessing the emergence of organic groups in which individuals tend to be integrated. These groups have certain traits of the old organic groups, but their collective life, their intellectual, emotional, and spiritual life is determined by propaganda, and they can no longer maintain themselves without it. They become organic groups in a mass society only if they subject themselves to and serve as agents of propaganda. Our society has been completely transformed when we left the purely individualistic stage, which permitted propaganda to develop. We arrived at a society in which primary group structures could still exist, but in which total propaganda was established, and the group no longer could be separated from such propaganda. It is curious to see how the few remaining organic groups, such as the family and the church, try at all costs to live by propaganda. Families are protected by family associations. Churches try to take over the methods of psychological influence. They are now the very negation of the old organic groups. And what is more, the new primary groups, such as political parties or unions, are important relay stations in the flow of total propaganda. They are mobilized and used as instruments, and thus offer no fulcrum for individual resistance. On the contrary, through them the entrapped individual is made ready for propaganda. Fuck, I'm already at 40 minutes. Okay, we're almost done. Another objection comes to mind immediately. Propaganda has developed in societies that were neither individualist nor mass. The Russian society of 1917, present-day China, Indochina, the Arab world. But the point here is precisely that these societies cannot and cannot be captured, manipulated, and mobilized by propaganda, except when their traditional structures disintegrate and a new society is developed, which is both individualistic and massive. Where this fails to happen, propaganda remains ineffective. Therefore, if the new society does not constitute itself spontaneously, it is sometimes formed by force by authoritarian states, which only then can utilize propaganda. In the Soviet Union, the Caucasus and Azerbaijan were the nursery of agitprop in 1917 because of cosmopolitanism of the region, the great currents of population displacement, the uprooting, the vigor of nationalist myth tended to shape mass society. In Soviet Russia, propaganda has progressed exactly in line with the destruction of the old organic groups and the creation of mass society. We know, too, that the establishment of the Viet Minh organization in Indochina permitted the structuring of a complete administrative society, imposing itself on traditional groups. The Lien Viet, with its independent and centralized hierarchy, artificially provoked a new splitting of the traditional groups of inhabitants, upsetting families, villages, and neighborhoods, and exploding the old forms in order to integrate individuals into new groups. A person classified according to his age, sex, and occupation, the family group is thus destroyed. Children do not belong to the same groups as their parents. Each group thus created is an approximately homogeneous block of members with the same needs, the same tastes, the same functions. Propaganda can then easily develop, capture individuals forced into these artificial groups. There can be sessions of directed discussion. The themes in the youth group will be very different from those in the adult group. Sessions of self-criticism. You can engage in sincere and easy self-criticism when not under parental control. French propaganda in Indochina failed partly because it respected traditional society and it structured small groups. We also find this true in Communist China, which attained in 3 years through violence what Soviet Union took 20 years to obtain and what developed naturally in the West in 150 years. The establishment of sociological conditions specific to an environment in which propaganda can be completely effective. It seems that the Chinese government understood perfectly the need to structure a new society. When the French wondered whether the methods of propaganda which had succeeded in Indochina could be applied in Algeria, they faced problems of the same sociological order. We find in the ultra-rapid forced systematic transformation of these societies a dramatic confirmation of our analysis, showing that a certain massification of society is required for propaganda to be able to develop. The attempt of the FLN to imitate the North Vietnamese, coupled with the establishment of 1 million Arabs in relocation camps by French authorities, brought about, each in its turn, each by its particular methods, this same sociological transformation. These operations are conducted simultaneously and in both cases desire to create a fertile ground of propaganda is not overlooked, far from it. Okay. Done. Done. Now I can turn my AC on. It's fucking hot as shit. But fuck. Fucking global warming and shit.